Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this interview finds you well wherever you are listening or watching today. I am beyond excited to share this next conversation with you, where I get to sit down with Dr. Scott Lyons. I have been trying to get Dr. Scott on the podcast for several months. He's a very busy man. He's the author of the new book, Addicted to Drama. And he was so willing to come on. It was just a matter of our schedules aligning. And so I'm just so glad that it finally happened and I can bring you all this interview because I think you're going to learn so much from him. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a holistic psychologist, educator, and author, a renowned body-based trauma expert, doctor of osteopathy, and mind-body medicine specialist. Scott helps people to break free from cycles of pain, limited beliefs, and trauma. Scott is an innovator in transformative wellness and trauma therapy, teaching over 500,000 people internationally to relieve stress and restore vitality. Scott has worked with many of the country's top leaders and CEOs as an executive coach and wellness consultant. He is the creator of the Embody Lab, the largest online learning platform for body-based trauma therapies, and developer of somatic stress release, a holistic process of restoring biological resilience, taught now in over 20 countries. He's also the founder and designer of Amala, a wellness brand dedicated to creating sustainably sourced tools for transformation. And that's why I wanted to bring him on, because I've been learning from Scott in some of his various offerings. And he is innovative. He's holistic. He brings in the somatic elements. He also speaks the attachment language. He's one that will just keep expanding your mind and your viewpoints. And his new book, Addicted to Drama, is amazing. And so we're going to talk a lot about that and all how this relates to attachment and some practical applications. And so without further ado, because this is the part you probably fast forward through all the time anyway, right? Like, let's just get to it, enjoy, and let me know what you think. Hello, Scott. Welcome.
Hello.
It is such a true honor to be joining you in conversation today. I am really excited to be here and for our listeners to learn from you, as I know they will.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Yes. And you're incredibly busy writing an amazing book and traveling all over the world. So thank you for taking the time. It's been months in the making, but I know that our community will have so much to learn from you. So I would love to invite more of you into our conversation. And I would love for you to share an attachment memory of your own that feels really important to you and to your work, and maybe the why of your work.
That's an interesting way to start. I like that. You know, it's interesting because there's the attachment stories we hear and like the stories that might be shared, and then there's the ones we feel in our body, and sometimes those are the ones that come up and sometimes they're not. And I know for me, like one of the stories that really struck me when I was a young adult, when my family told me, was that as my mom was giving birth to me, she herniated several of her discs and was bedbound for several months, and even hospital bound for the first bit of time. And you know, that story really hit me viscerally. As an adult or as a young adult, when I was like, oh, what a very volatile kind of dramatic way to enter into the world, not just for me, but also for her. And I've had the conversation with her, like, what was that like for you? How often did you see me? And, you know, some of it, which is interesting when she spoke about like, oh, you know, there were days where I couldn't see you. I was in too much pain, or it was, you know, heavily medicated. And some of that I remember going, oh, that doesn't really have a resonance in my body. Like that part of this story doesn't seem to have some sort of holding in me. And other parts of the story did. And I followed that in terms of my own process of healing and somatic processing as to like what actually still in the narrative that she could share still felt like it belonged or still felt like it existed as something to be metabolized and processed.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that. And
Mm,
I know that's one of the things that I so appreciate about you is your vulnerability to
mm,
share so openly. I think it really helps people connect with you in your work and in your teachings.
yeah.
And that example is such an example of how it can go back so early, even when we don't have
Yeah.
the words for it, that is a part of your experience and your earliest attachment memories, as well as, like you
Mm,
said, for your mom.
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, attachment is such a interesting thing to go back and work with as a therapist with a client because it's like we don't typically have, narrative memories until at least 3 years old, but we have our implicit memory, our body memory within the womb.
Mm-hmm.
Within the second trimester, we start developing that capacity to keep the score, so to speak. And depending on other traditions, including like body mind centering and other somatic traditions, they'll talk about even the first and second trimester having a body memory, having a body story. And then, of course, as we get into epigenetics, we're looking at like even before we're sort of formed, there's a memory that sort of is attached to us as we develop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, we could go so deep into that. And I think going to your new book, which I can't get enough of, Addicted to Drama, I think so much of that starts there, even when we don't have the narrative for it.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to share with our community, what do you mean when you talk about addiction to drama, and especially in the context of attachment?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we can start to play with or deconstruct is there's drama, which most of us might have some semblance of or understanding of, and then there's addiction. So I like to separate it out a little bit, and then we combine the two or connect them back in. And, we all kind of viscerally know drama. Like we know, like if I were to say to you, hey, do you know someone addicted to drama? I imagine someone comes to mind, even if you don't know what the definition of it is.
Oh, yes.
And like you might have a visceral response. You might have even like a disgust face on you, something, because we know it impacts ourselves and we know it impacts us and we know it plagues other people. And so, but we don't necessarily know how to define it, except like oftentimes people say like, oh, that's just someone who needs attention. And for the most part, that couldn't be farther from what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
So drama is the unnecessary turmoil. It's the exaggeration, it's the intensification of narratives and stories and emotions that someone projects out or creates within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's representative of a dysregulation in the nervous system. And and it means that the efficiency of emotions, energy, and attention are not being, someone can't accurately measure how much is needed to functionally adapt and or interact in the world. And that's where we start to look at the drama as an issue,
Mm-hmm.
because drama can also be fun too, right? Like you go to a movie and there's like deep suspense and there's like entertainment value to it. But where it starts to go really challenging is where that dysregulation becomes like the constant,
Mm-hmm.
where that inefficiency to accurately measure how much energy, attention, and emotion is needed. And so there's a disproportionate response to what's actually happening in front of you or around you. And so that's the addiction part. And then we go, whoa, how could someone be possibly addicted to that? Because how could someone become attached or dependent on things that make them more stressful or agitated or activated or dysregulated? Why would someone become addicted to their dysregulated state? And the answer is somewhat simple, is because chasing the drama helps them avoid the trauma.
Mm.
And so, meaning there's some type of survival mechanism that underlines it and it's like fuel to continue it. And that's really what an addiction is, right?
Mm.
There's some type of underlying urge, driver to continue something as a means of avoidance, as a
Mm-hmm.
means of protection, as a means of survival. And so things like stress that we often hear like, oh, stress is bad for you. And that's kind of where the sort of ideology or the understanding of stress lives. But there's so much more to it. And when we start to understand like the benefits, so to speak, of stress. So when we're in a stress state, and there are things like it provides more energy. So often for people who have a trauma background, you'll see things like depression or depressed immune system or depressed energy system, which are kind of all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a malaise. There's a sense of like, oh, there's something wrong with me, and what is actually underneath is there's an inefficiency of energy use. So the dysfunction that we were talking about earlier is represented by a challenging a challenge to homeostasis, a challenge to how much energy is used, and the effectiveness of preserving it for adaptation. Also, like when you have a lot of trauma, it takes out of your energy bank. There's always some type of energy being taken out of your everyday need towards maintaining the stuckness of it in your body. So when we're talking about how stress actually provides a level of energy, it's like an extra battery pack. It's like drinking coffee.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all know this state. Like when you're starting to get stressed out and activated, you totally often feel the release of all that cortisol and adrenaline and streaming through your blood, and you feel the rise of energy so you can act.
Mm-hmm.
And so we become attached, for one, to that extra battery pack, to finally having some energy to go do something. And the problem is that we have to go seek or create the crisis and the chaos to get that energy.
Mm-hmm.
Another component of stress that's really interesting, like I didn't know this growing up, but it wasn't until began my research that I was like, oh, stress is um, one of our most effective pain relievers. Because what happens in a state of stress is it blocks the pain receptors. So if you have ever gone for a run and you know that runner's high, what's actually happening is that running is a stress on the body. And what
Mm-hmm.
happens is it releases those endorphins, which block the pain receptors. And you feel that sort of, sense of elation. It's like, oh, I feel good. But
Right.
what it is it's just like an opioid blocker. And so stress does that naturally. So does love. Isn't that
Mm-hmm.
interesting? Love and stress are the most effective pain relievers we have that are self-producing. And since for some of us, if love doesn't feel safe as a period, then we don't use it as a pain reliever, especially if we've had relational trauma. So what are we going to use? Stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two alone are really, evidence of, but there's even more. Like one of the things that happens at trauma, whether it's developmental trauma or attachment trauma, is that we start to lose sensation of our body. And we disconnect, we dissociate, we take a vacation from our own selves. And what happens in that process is we begin to lose our ability to map our sense of self in relation to the world. And we become numb. And in that numbness, we also lose a sense of purpose. So there's a real connection in neuroscience between a sense of self, to self-esteem, to self-worth, to self-soothing, to even a sense of self-purpose. Without self, we don't have any of those other pieces. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that going in and creating big scenarios or big emotions, big stressful experiences help rise above the threshold of that numbness so we feel something.
Mm-hmm.
And so feeling something gives us a sense of where and how we are, but it requires the decibel of stimulus to be at such a higher volume than what most people need.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things really create this attachment, this dependency on it. And, I don't know about you, but I grew up with a lot of early developmental trauma, felt very alone in the world. And, one of the things that's really interesting is that crisis or stress is also one of the most effective social bonding agents. It is social glue. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we bond through drama.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there's a great study that was done at one of the universities in Australia, where they made a group of individuals. They had a neutral group and what's called the control group, and then the other group. And the control group stuck their hand in like tepid water, so neutral water, and the other group had to stick their hand in ice cold water. And the group that stuck their hand in ice cold water, so who experienced some pain together, worked more efficiently and effectively towards the next tasks that they had to complete. And they felt closer in relation to each other than the group that didn't experience some type of drama or crisis. And so those four things, the energy, the pain relief, the social glue, these things, the increase of sensation away from numbness, these things create a dependency, because we can't get them anywhere else if we've had this long lasting experience of trauma that's been stored in our body and created this numbness, this disconnect, this malaise, this lack of energy, this lack of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So much depth in that response. And I think I'm going to use, and I'll always give you credit, but the new tagline is we chase the drama to avoid the trauma.
Yeah.
And the other thing, and I love that you threw some research in there that I was not familiar with, because I think that helps normalize this propensity towards addiction to drama. And I know it's
Sure.
a spectrum,
Yeah.
but like you said, we all know someone. You asked that in your book too. And as soon as you ask that question, of course, we all have this intuitive knowing of somebody who has some addiction to drama. A couple people in my family and friend circle came right to mind. And then I also love that you invite us to look at ourselves too, because it's easier, of course, to identify others. It's always easier. But yet we all have this, some propensity, like, you talk about it being a spectrum. I've heard you talk about in other spaces. So I think it's so important to look at our own histories. It can be difficult to do that, but very important. And how we relate to drama and stress and how that might be helping meet some of our needs.
Yeah.
And then also the others that we're in relationship with. The other thing that I wonder keeps this going is this familiarity that we feel within our bodies and our nervous systems when we're creating this chaos and drama, that there's this sense of comfort and safety. And then that can go back to, again, those earlier developmental relationships and attachment patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something really interesting about great questions, by the way. And, we often think of attachment purely as the relationship between the child and the parent or the caregivers. And back in the day, it used to just be between the kid and the mom, which we now know is, not the case. But where attachment is expanding is to really be able to identify, oh, wait, there's a attunement that also happens between the child and the environment, or the child and the community. And if there's a lot of challenge in the environment, if there's a lot of chaos, if there's even a lot of sounds, for example, like car honking, trains, that we've identified in the research, that too can disrupt the bonding, and they become attuned to the ecosystem. So what's interesting is that when a child cannot attune with a parent, they will attune with the environment. And if the environment is also chaos, they will adapt that like a sponge as their internal environment, and that becomes the status quo. And so what we talk about as comfortable is it's comfortable because that has become the normal. And it can feel very dysregulating and even threatening when we challenge the normal, because we have adapted all of our survival mechanisms to maintain that what we think as the effective or efficient homeostasis, which is really, in often cases, just an internalization of the crisis and a normalization of it. And I discern that because homeostasis means that there's a level to which we are able to be adaptive. And what's challenging is that when we've internalized chaos, is that we aren't actually being adaptive. We need a certain level of crisis constantly. So if we're in a calm environment, like a yoga class, for example, and we're in it and it starts to get quiet, we become agitated, or we start to think of memories or stories or create scenarios in our head to get out of that sense of calm. And we're not able to adapt and be in calm just as much as we are able to adapt and be in spaces that are chaotic. And that's the difference between a true functional adaptive homeostasis versus an internalization of crisis as the normal.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So again, I think that goes back to that normalization, that this has been adaptive
Yeah.
for
Mm-hmm.
people. And that's what I was trying to say earlier, but
Yeah.
I easily lose track because you have so much great information, is when we can, we know those people that are addicted to
Yeah.
trauma, but what doesn't come as easy is really trying to understand the root causes of that.
Yeah.
And that these are people, including sometimes ourselves, that
Mm-hmm.
are really in pain and that have these
Yeah.
unmet needs.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can shift in that way, I think it just opens up so many more possibilities.
Yeah. There's some really beautiful research that shows like when someone's able to be validated, it actually relaxes the muscles. So I call that a validation reflex. And what's not possible in most individuals who've had significant trauma and shows up as addiction to drama is that they're not able to feel validated. They're not able to lower the drawbridge of connection, that bridge, to allow other people's recognition in. It feels too vulnerable, too dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so they constantly feel unseen, unheard, and that pattern gets replicated. That they'll find the scenarios, or because they're not able to let people in, it proves like a cognitive bias, the confirmation bias, excuse me, that they're not able to be seen and heard in this world. No one has their back. And so one of the consequences of that is that they do something called weaponized empathy, which is in because I can't take in that you actually see and hear and can empathize with me, I in turn create scenarios or create situations to which you might feel as bad as I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll keep attacking you or getting into fights with you or reminding you of that way that you hurt me until I perceive that you feel the same ache, the same pain, the same loneliness that I feel. And that's called weaponized empathy, which is, a pretty prevalent thing I see more and more in our culture is like, I saw a couple when I used to do more couples work a couple of years ago, in which the wife was not able to release an old story, and we got to a point where I said, what would be the worst that could happen if you release that old story? And she would say, and she said, well, then he would never understand how bad I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at the same time, she couldn't release the story, so she couldn't release how bad she feels. She couldn't trust that he could ever empathize with her or understand, because she couldn't lower that drawbridge and let him in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see how these cycles of weaponized empathy just build on more and more of the underlying pattern of loneliness, and maintaining the trauma within.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this feeling of no one really truly gets me.
Yeah.
And so weaponizing the empathy, I think, just is a way to keep them, like you said, keep the drawbridge up.
Yeah. It's why, like, if you've ever been around someone who's addicted to drama, you feel like they just pulled you into their crisis. It's like a tornado of sorts. Like they
Mm-hmm.
just pull you in, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, what just happened? How did I get involved in that?
Yeah, some whiplash going on now.
Some whiplash, some addicted to drama whiplash. It's real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's real in the sense of that is their safest way of connecting. Not
Mm-hmm.
only can they siphon off some of the energy to help them keep rolling down the drama hill, so to speak, but it's the closest they can feel. Again, remember, we bond through crisis and chaos. And for them, that is how they feel connected. I mean, often, you know, as kids, where did we get the most attention? I know for me, when I was sick or in trouble or challenged in some point in my life, that's where my parents showed up the most. And so that became the sort of the way in which I recognized I was loved, is when there was something wrong. And that seeps in and becomes like, oh, if I want to be loved and seen and heard, I need to be in constant crisis and chaos. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that's hard to break out of, to trust that, oh, I will be recognized, I will be honored, I will be met, I will be loved if things are also okay or even good.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I wonder how this shows up for a parent or caregiver who
Mhm.
has a higher propensity towards this addiction to trauma. What have you seen in their interactions with their children?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about a chaotic environment, it's as though often in these cases the parent is projecting into the environment. So not only are they chaotic, but they are creating chaos in the ecosystem, the environment to which the child is growing up in. And they can't settle. I mean, like the parents I have, look, if you're a parent, you know what it's like. It's fucking hard. It is so hard. You don't
Mhm.
sleep. Especially if it's your first kid, you think like every little sniff or, cold is like, is this it? Are they going to
Mhm.
be okay? Like that. And there's a hypervigilance, so I just want to honor being a parent is super hard. And
Absolutely.
as my mom used to say when I was a kid, she was like, "Well, no one's ever written a book about it," which is
Mhm.
not true. But like what she meant is like there's no true manual for it. There's so many books and so many people have ideas, and in the end, it kind of feels like you have some support, but you're also alone.
Mhm.
And so I just want to normalize that. And what I find for parents who are really in these cycles of addiction to drama and crisis and chaos is that they're crisis hopping with their kid. They're like, oh, like what if he doesn't get into Harvard? And what if this cold is really a sign of allergies? And it's like they're so fixed in the crises that they're unable to rest and enjoy and receive and be in connection and attunement with the child themselves. And that lack of attunement leads to lack of co-regulation, meaning that the child then isn't able to learn the processes of self-regulation, of self-soothing. And so they also aren't equipped to be adaptive in the world, and are going to be more um, related to crisis and chaos than they are to ease and calm.
Mhm. Yes. Secure attachment is not characterized by drama.
Mhm.
And I appreciate the way you again normalize that, as parents already have so much on their plates,
So much.
and yet if they have this, higher propensity towards addiction to drama and crisis and chaos, then they're more likely to project that unmet need
Yeah.
onto their relationship with their
Yeah.
child, and then their
Yeah.
child internalizes that. So, it's those transgenerational ways that these patterns also get passed down, which I know you also talk about in your book.
Yeah. And as a kid, you kind of have two choices, is what I've seen in the research and working with clients. You kind of either join into the chaos or you become passive to it and kind of deflate and become frozen.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting in the process of like, I didn't say this in the book, but I, interviewed my sister on my podcast and we
I
talked
listened
about
to that
this.
and I loved it.
And I was like, I joined the fight. I was like, I learned to be agitated and I learned to like throw logs on the fire and siphon from that energy in the world and utilize that to get up and do things. And she really deflated in response
Mhm.
to the crisis and the chaos and the drama in our family, and would hide literally in bathrooms. And it and really struggled in her life with like actualizing and feeling motivated to go do things. She would go attend to other people, God bless, more than she would attend to herself because she just didn't feel like she knew how.
Mhm.
And to make big life choices, she just felt like she 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 didn't have the energy or the know-how to, where she could, go and work with all these school kids who have so many challenges and just feel like she's at ease.
Mhm.
So, it's to say like it's not only contagious at times in the family, that addiction to drama, and it pours into the kids, but it also like they have to make a choice. Do I join in to the addiction or do I deflate and become numb?
Mhm.
Which can sometimes lead to that addiction to drama anyways.
Mhm.
Just try to feel something in the world.
Yeah. I really love that episode. The two of you together were so hilarious and so real, which also makes me think about the sibling relationship
Yeah.
and how that maybe buffered some of that trauma that and drama that you talk about that was
Mm.
in your household. And yeah, I mean, is there more you want to say about the sibling relationships and attachment?
Yeah, I mean, the Venn diagram of sibling realities might be overlapping and it might be quite different. Like, for example, my sister and I grew up in the same household. We have some shared memories, but we have very different perceptions of how we grew up. I have memories that were much more violent and aggressive and frightening, and ideas around money and politics that emerge from that are very different from her. Like I thought we grew up in a very um, uh, in a financial place that was very on survival mode. That's what I remember, and for her, she doesn't have that memory. And so like it's also a very interesting thing about like, and I remember growing up where there was a lot more drama in our family and crisis, and not just, I don't mean with my parents, I mean in my extended family. And she doesn't have that sense as that it was when we were kids. She had it more that it was somewhat present, but really more present when we were adults. And so, like, there's this interesting thing again about like, um, sibling experiences are going to be somewhat overlapping, but also different. And how do you appreciate their experience and their reality and not feel like they have to also have the same to feel validated in your own?
Right. I'm so
So,
glad you named that. And
yeah.
it probably makes sense if your sister was more deflated and numb
Yep.
and shut down, that
Yep.
her memories and experiences, interpretations are going to be much different.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's such a beautiful point and reflection of what I was sharing, because it's like we all have our own compensations and our survival mechanisms, and they affect how our memory works. And
Hmm.
how our memory works affects how our sense of reality exists.
Hmm. Yeah. The other thing that I appreciate that your book does so beautifully, and also when I've heard you teach in other spaces, is when you talk about boundaries.
Mhm.
And I would love for you to just give us some insight on how boundaries impact our sense of self and those attachment patterns, and especially if we could bring it back to, a baby's earliest experiences with boundaries, and how does that either, support the attachment process or possibly hinder it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, boundaries have been something that's become really a popular thing. And it's like, and as I have heard it in the last couple of years, it's like boundaries are what you say yes to and what you say no to. And, that's an interesting idea. And there's some accuracy to it. I think it's a limited idea. But long before we had words, we had boundaries. And so that's an important thing um, to recognize. Is like, okay, well, how did boundaries show up non-verbally before we could say yes or no? And one of the things is looking at, where did we first have a sense of boundary? So our first boundary was being in the womb. We had literally a barrier, whether it's to sound or stimulus or other things, to food, which was about regulation, was about how much yes, how much no were we getting of stimulus, of food, of sound, all of these things. And and the buffer offered some type of modulation. Now, another level of boundary that came, post birth was like literally being held in our parents' arm. The contact, the touch gave us a sense, or began to help us map where we began and where we ended. And that level of safe holding created a sense of barrier, just like the womb did. And so we internalize this, as we were kids and become adults, is these early sense of boundaries. Were they present? Were they safe? If a parent feels very uncertain when they're holding us, and doesn't give us a firm sense of clarity, that might actually impact the security of our sense of boundary. And, and again, what it comes back to is, do we have the ability in our life to be adaptive in how much yes and how much no? Do we have agency in that? And if the answer is yes, that's really representative of, there is boundary. There's been boundary established. And if it's no, it's like, oh, I don't like, some situation happens and I always react the same way, regardless of how I'm feeling in that moment. That's actually often a boundary rupture, like
Hmm.
where we don't have the ability to shift and adapt, and to say, oh, this is too much sound, or can you turn that down, or can you turn that up?
Hmm. So I think that goes back to the earlier question of how a parent or caregiver who has more addiction to drama and chaos might be interacting with their baby and their child. And when they're kind of projecting their stuff onto their baby and their child, they're not as likely to read those cues for when a boundary is needed, or to, maybe be too invasive and not
Yeah,
recognize that the baby's maybe looking away and saying, I need a break.
yeah,
Or not engaging at all, recognizing that here's some cues for I'm here, engage with me, but I'm, responding to my own stuff right now. And
yeah.
so I think that bringing boundaries into the context of attachment, like you said, especially those nonverbals when it first started, is so needed, and really appreciate the way your book does this and your teachings do this. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you really naming that sense of when attunement is off. So that ability to register the cues, then, what ends up happening is the child doesn't get met and seen and felt and heard. And that's a pretty early rupture.
Mm-hmm.
And that rupture becomes stored in the body because, especially if the parent doesn't know how to do the repair or isn't co-regulating to support the repair, then that rupture consistently of being unmet, unneeded, unseen resides in the body and builds up to become a level of numbness. And that level of numbness needs a certain level of stimulation to overcome it. And then we see just the sort of one of the pathways of an addiction to drama.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that goes to, in your book, you talk about these boundary challenges versus boundary ruptures or violations.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important way to look at it too, because in those parent-child interactions, there's going to be matches and mismatches. And I think that would fall more into that challenged category. And that happens all throughout life.
Yeah.
But then there's also these bigger kind of violations or ruptures, and especially when those are not met with the ability to repair and co-regulate, then that's when those patterns really become more internalized into our sense of who we are in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, being able to even discern, that's just a boundary challenge. Like, oh, my partner didn't respect my timing, which I had laid out. That's a challenge. That's not a rupture, but if someone, and it's not so circumstantial, because it might feel like a rupture to me if I'm not able to really be like, oh, it's, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a big deal. So my ability to zoom out, and if everything feels like a rupture, you're probably addicted to drama.
Yes.
Yeah. But if you're able to go, oh, that's irritating. That's like, ooh, that feels frustrating. But it doesn't knock me down or send me in a tizzy. Where a boundary rupture, there's often a lot of freeze in the system. Like if you've ever opened the door to your house on a really cold day and you're like, ooh, there's a little bit of shock and freeze and some immobility and it takes some time for you not just to warm up but to melt from the shock of it. That's more what happens in a rupture. And it takes some time to not only repair yourself, but to come back into bridge the connection between yourself and someone else.
I had a wise colleague, and I don't know where he got this from, so I can't give credit to where it originated, but he talked about the difference between disagreeable versus unacceptable. And I apply this to so much in my work and personal life as well. It's like, we can kind of dance around the disagreeable. That's going to happen. Like I said, those matches and mismatches. But when it crosses that line, and our lines may be different, depending on our history, like you talked about, or if we're addicted to drama or not. But when it crosses that line, you open that door, and that's where it reaches into that unacceptable threshold.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah. And I know that you are a much different person now than some of the memories you shared about as a younger child. And I wonder what you've done within your own healing. And also, I know you talk about this so much in your book about how do you heal from this addiction to drama?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things to recognize is it's going to be a different path for each person. And I will say it takes time for this because there's a lot of layers to it. Becoming more comfortable with discomfort and becoming more comfortable with silence and space and calm is its own whole process. And there's a lot of rewiring that happens in this process of becoming unaddicted to drama. And you'll have relapses. And even so, recognizing and normalizing relapse is also part of the process. But essentially, The first piece, as in most processes of healing, is awareness, is going, oh, I think I'm revving myself, or I'm noticing they said this, and the response, according to other people, seems maybe a little bit bigger than what's needed. So I start to go, what's happening in that moment? I don't feel like it's bigger than what's needed, but like if other people keep giving me that feedback, I go, what's happening? Oh, I feel so much fire in my chest, and I feel like a gripping in my whole face, and I feel like I'm reaching out to try to get people to come towards me and pushing them away at the same time. Whatever your awareness is, you start to build that recognition. And over time, you'll also become aware of going, oh, they said this, and I started adding in my own scripts or other ways of what we call revving. So then essentially stimulating, activating, agitating yourself. That's what revving is. So it's like, oh, I found myself in a thought bind, which is like, oh, I want this, but if I get that, that means this. But if I don't do that, then it means this. That's a bind. And I just keep myself in agitation. Or I'm creating stories in my head. That's a rev. Or I'm getting into fights with people when we could have just talked it through. All of those are revving ways of creating more stress in my system, and or more energy, as we might call it. And starting to recognize when I'm doing that is going to be key, because as we create more space between desiring to do that and actually doing it, that's the passageway that we will eventually need to get to the underlying trauma that's kind of fueling it all.
Mm-hmm.
So, another step along the way then is then getting through that sort of arc, or that space, and starting to process and metabolize through things like somatic experiencing or sensory motor processing or any other really EMDR, any other really great technique of processing the trauma. And then we have a lot of processes of letting go of our attachment, or what we might say is our label. So it's like, this is who I am, is often one of the things my clients will say. I'm just an anxious person. And so like I might say, as we're moving through some of the trauma and such, I might say, well, who else would you be? Who else are you in addition to this? Not to say that's not who you are, because that's who you have been for a long time. And so we start to build other options of who they are besides the crisis and the chaos that they found themselves in over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
or the victim.
Mm-hmm. Those labels are so powerful and resonant in our physiology. And I really appreciate in the book how, because I know we can't, healing, we could talk about, go on and on and on. But in the book, you have so many prompts, journaling, ways to reframe our language, all of that. So it'll be a great resource to our community. We also have a lot of therapists that listen. And so I love how you also offer a therapist might suggest.
Yeah.
And so for those of you working with clients who have an addiction to drama, there's some things that you can really utilize in this book to help your clients and as well. So in addition to that, tell us more about the amazing resources and things that you do, because that's how I discovered you. And now I can't stop consuming you and all your offerings, because just when I think you've like put out the coolest thing, then it's like, oh, now there's a certificate in this. And so tell us more.
Yeah. So I founded something called the Embody Lab, which is a hub for somatic and embodied education. And we have a lot of resources on there. We have free resources in terms of like summits that we offer once a month or once every other month. We have a lot of workshops and certificate programs, like you did our somatic attachment therapy program or a trauma therapy program. We have an EMDR program, and we have lots of exciting things on the horizon that I can't quite name yet. But I love, one of my favorite things in the world is creating curriculum and programming. And I'm happy to just be able to do that with some of the most incredible teachers in the world coming in and offering their wisdom in this way. And so that's and really, like the idea of the Embody Lab was at the heart of it was accessible education, because a lot of these somatic programs take years, and we don't have years necessarily. We don't feel like we have years, or we don't feel like we have all the incredible expense it costs often to get trained or to help heal ourselves. And so that was a big part of like, what can we do to offer more accessible education, available online, for example, at lower prices than most programming. And so that was at the heart of our values in creating the Embody Lab. And also have my podcast, which is a lot of fun and playful as well. It's called The Gently Used Human, with Dr. Scott Lyons, and have some fun guests and really deconstruct science and psychology, and through a lens of really like recognizing we're all gently used humans just trying to make it in the world. Yeah, my book, and online, I'm on social media, I'm at Dr. Scott Lyons. So there's posts and lots of video clips there of resources and tools and stuff like that as well.
Yes. People can be sucked into a good vortex this time of so much rich learning. And like I told you in the beginning before we even started recording, that's why I wanted you on here, because you've helped expand my thinking and skills so much when it comes to attachment and trauma work, and really bringing in a more holistic and innovative way of looking at it and bringing in the somatics into it. And I'm so grateful to you. And I know our community, if they haven't discovered you, will have so much fun doing that. And we'll be sure to link all of those things in the show notes. And unfortunately, our conversation is wrapping up, but this is all that I expected it to be and more. So thank you, Scott. And I want to end on one final question, which is, what do you envision for the future when it comes to all the amazing work that you're doing?
Gosh, I mean, I'm just started adding back in live events. And so I think that there's, I'm really excited about the possibilities in the future of what both live and online education can do in terms of somatics and embodiment. And I think that, I don't know, for me, then like there's just so much more to learn and integrate. And so there's just so much on the horizon I'm excited about, and possibilities. So
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And I can't wait to join you in some of that and hear what's next. So thank you so much for being a guest today. And I look forward to when our paths will cross again. So I know I'm going to keep learning from you.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much for your interest and your love of somatics and healing, and all the work that you're doing with your communities as well.
Oh, thank you. All right. Take care.